I used to believe that love meant sacrifice, that a good wife puts her husband's needs first, trusts his judgment about money, and never questions the man who promised to provide for her. I believed that right up until the morning I found myself standing in my own kitchen, tears streaming down my face, begging my husband for $20 to buy groceries while he sat at our granite countertop eating a $60 steak he'd ordered for himself the night before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Michelle Rodriguez, though for 8 years I answered to Sarah Chen. I'm 42 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought I was living the American dream in our beautiful colonial house on Maple Lane in Riverside, Ohio. I thought my husband Michael was protecting me by handling all our finances. I thought his mother Patricia was just concerned about our family's well-being when she suggested I didn't need access to our accounts. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be lies I told myself to survive in a prison I didn't even know I was living in. The funny thing about financial abuse is how slowly it creeps in, like ivy growing up the side of a house. You don't notice it at first because it looks like care, like protection, like love. When Michael and I got married in 2016, I was 34 and running a successful marketing consultancy from my downtown Cleveland apartment. I had my own checking account, my own savings, my own credit cards, and I'd just sold my first business for a considerable profit that I'd carefully invested in a diversified portfolio. I was independent, confident, and financially secure. Michael was different from the men I'd dated before. Where others were intimidated by my success, he seemed genuinely impressed. He was 36, a certified public accountant who'd built his own firm, Chen Associates, from the ground up. He drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and took me to restaurants where the wine cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. He seemed stable, successful, and refreshingly uncomplicated after years of dating men who couldn't handle a woman who made more money than they did. Our courtship was a whirlwind of romantic gestures and careful planning. Michael proposed with a 2-carat diamond ring at the top of the terminal tower on a clear September evening when you could see all the way to Lake Erie. He'd arranged for a photographer to capture the moment, had champagne waiting, and even coordinated with my best friend Jennifer to make sure I was wearing the blue dress he'd complimented months earlier. Everything was perfect, orchestrated, and completely overwhelming in the best possible way. The first red flag should have been the prenup, but Michael presented it so reasonably that I almost felt foolish for hesitating. We were sitting in his office on a Thursday evening, surrounded by law books and the faint smell of his expensive cologne, when he slid the document across his mahogany desk with an apologetic smile. "It's just a precaution, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "My lawyer insists on it, and honestly, it protects both of us. You have your assets, I have mine, and if anything ever happened, we'd both be covered." He reached across to squeeze my hand. "Though nothing's going to happen to us. We're going to be together forever." I should have taken the document to my own lawyer. I should have questioned why a man who claimed to love me unconditionally needed legal protection from that love. Instead, I signed it in his office that night, trusting that the man I was about to marry would never use it against me. After all, wasn't marriage supposed to be about trust? The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of as a little girl. 200 guests at the Riverside Country Club, white roses and fairy lights everywhere, and a reception that Michael's mother, Patricia, had planned down to the last detail. Patricia was a formidable woman in her 60s who dressed exclusively in designer suits and had never worked a day in her life, having married Michael's father straight out of college. She had opinions about everything, from the color of my nail polish to the appropriateness of my career, but she delivered them with such sweet concern that disagreeing felt rude. "Sarah, dear," she said during our cake tasting, her perfectly manicured hand resting on my arm, "you'll want to think about scaling back your work once you're married. Michael needs a wife who can support his career properly. All the most successful men have wives who understand their role. I laughed it off at the time, assuming she was just old-fashioned. I had no intention of giving up my consultancy, and Michael had never suggested I should. In fact, he seemed proud of my success, often mentioning my business achievements to his friends and colleagues. I thought Patricia would come around once she saw how happy her son and I were together. After the honeymoon in Tuscany, we settled into married life in Michael's house in Oakwood Heights, a prestigious neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. The house itself was stunning. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and a backyard with a pool that sparkled like a jewel in the summer sun. It was the kind of home I'd always imagined raising children in, though Michael had been vague about his timeline for starting a family. The first change was subtle. About 6 months after the wedding, Michael suggested we consolidate our finances to make things simpler. It made sense, he explained, sitting at our kitchen island with his laptop open to a spreadsheet that showed how much we could save on banking fees and investment management by combining our accounts. "We're a team now, baby," he said, pulling me close and kissing the top of my head. "What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. That's what marriage is about, right? Partnership." I was touched by the sentiment and practical enough to appreciate the logic. Managing multiple accounts was unnecessarily complicated now that we were sharing expenses. What I didn't realize was that when Michael said, "combine our accounts," he meant transfer everything into accounts that only he could access. My name was on them, technically, but I wasn't given debit cards, checkbooks, or online banking access. "It's temporary," he assured me when I asked about getting my own debit card. "The bank is being ridiculous about the paperwork. I'll get it sorted out next week." Next week turned into next month, which turned into next year. Whenever I brought it up, there was always another excuse, another delay, another bureaucratic hurdle that would be resolved soon. In the meantime, Michael gave me cash for my expenses. At first, it was generous, more than enough for groceries, gas, and the personal items I needed. If I wanted something bigger, I just had to ask, and he was usually happy to provide it. The asking became a habit so gradually that I didn't notice when it became a requirement. When my car needed new tires, I asked Michael. When I wanted to get my hair done at the salon I'd been going to for years, I asked Michael. When my sister's birthday came around and I wanted to buy her something nice, I asked Michael. Each request was met with questions about necessity, cost, comparisons, and gentle suggestions about more practical alternatives. "Do you really need to spend $200 on a haircut, sweetheart?" He'd ask with a concerned expression. "That seems excessive. Maybe you could find somewhere more reasonable?" The salon I'd been going to for 5 years suddenly seemed frivolous and overpriced. The birthday gift I'd wanted to buy my sister seemed unnecessarily extravagant. The name brand groceries I preferred seemed wasteful when the store brand was just as good. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One by one, my choices became smaller, more justified, more carefully considered against Michael's gentle but persistent financial wisdom. My business began to suffer as I struggled to manage client relationships without easy access to funds for business expenses. Taking clients to lunch required planning and asking Michael for money, which felt awkward and unprofessional. Purchasing software or supplies meant justifying every expense to a man who increasingly questioned whether my business was worth the investment of time and money. "You're working so hard for such small returns," Michael said one evening as I sat at my laptop in our home office, trying to finish a proposal for a potential client. "Maybe it's time to consider whether this is the best use of your energy. You could focus on other things, like making our house a real home." The suggestion stung, partly because my business returns had been declining, but mostly because I was beginning to suspect that the decline wasn't entirely due to market forces. when you can't move quickly on opportunities, can't invest in the tools you need, and can't maintain the professional relationships that drive referrals. Even the most successful business will start to wither. Patricia was thrilled when I finally closed my consultancy 18 months after the wedding. She took me out to lunch at the country club to celebrate what she called my transition into proper married life. "Now, you can focus on what really matters," she said, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. "Michael needs a wife who can entertain properly, maintain their home, and eventually give him the children he deserves. You'll be so much happier once you stop trying to compete with him professionally." I wanted to argue, to explain that I wasn't competing with anyone, that I'd loved my work and had been good at it. But sitting in that country club dining room, surrounded by other wives who lunched and shopped and volunteered while their husbands built empires, I began to wonder if maybe Patricia was right. Maybe I had been trying to prove something that didn't need proving. Maybe being Michael's wife was enough. Without my business income, I became completely dependent on Michael's generosity for everything. He was generous at first, giving me a weekly allowance that covered groceries, gas, and personal expenses with enough left over for small luxuries. He even encouraged me to pursue hobbies, suggesting I might enjoy taking cooking classes or volunteering at the local elementary school. I threw myself into making our house beautiful and our life comfortable. I learned to cook elaborate meals, maintained a garden that was the envy of our neighbors, and volunteered at Oakwood Elementary School 3 days a week, helping with reading programs and organizing fundraisers. I was good at these things, and they filled some of the void left by my abandoned career. The weekly allowance system worked for about a year. Michael would sit down with me every Sunday morning, review our expenses from the previous week, and hand me cash for the coming week. It felt organized and responsible, like we were a team managing our household budget together. I didn't question why I needed to save receipts for everything or why Michael wanted detailed explanations for purchases over $20. The first time he reduced my allowance, it seemed reasonable. Business had been slow at his firm, he explained, and we needed to tighten our belts temporarily. Instead of $300 a week, I'd get $250. It meant being more careful about groceries, maybe skipping my monthly manicure, but it wasn't devastating. I was proud of myself for adjusting so smoothly, for being the kind of wife who could adapt when times were tough. Times stayed tough for months, but only for me. Michael continued to buy expensive wines, took frequent business trips to cities. I'd always wanted to visit, and upgraded his BMW to a newer model. When I asked about the inconsistency, he patiently explained that his business expenses were investments in our future, while household expenses were costs to be minimized. "I have to spend money to make money, baby," he said, adjusting his new Rolex watch. "You understand that, right? Everything I do is for us, for our future." I wanted to understand. I tried to understand. But it became increasingly difficult to explain why his business lunches at expensive restaurants were necessary investments, while my request for grocery money to buy the ingredients for those meals was subject to intense scrutiny. The scrutiny intensified gradually. Michael began questioning every purchase, every receipt, every dollar I spent. Why did I buy name-brand pasta instead of store brand? Why did I go to the expensive grocery store instead of the discount chain across town? Why did I need new jeans when the ones I had were perfectly functional? Each question was asked with love and concern, framed as financial wisdom and partnership. Michael wasn't trying to control me. He was trying to teach me to be smarter with money. He wasn't being unreasonable. He was being responsible. He wasn't punishing me. He was helping us build a secure future together. The weekly allowance became daily monitoring. Michael began reviewing receipts every evening, questioning purchases and making suggestions for future improvements. The grocery budget was reduced again, from $250 a week to $200, then to $150. I learned to shop strategically, clipping coupons, buying in bulk when items were on sale, stretching every dollar until it screamed. I started losing weight, Not intentionally, but because I was eating less to make the food budget stretch. Michael noticed and complimented me on my discipline, suggesting that maybe the reduced budget was actually good for both of us. I was getting healthier, our finances were improving, and I was learning valuable skills that would serve me well for the rest of my life. Jennifer noticed the changes when she visited for my birthday that fall. We'd been best friends since college, and she'd never been shy about expressing her opinions. She found me in the kitchen making dinner from ingredients I'd carefully portioned to last the rest of the week, and her expression shifted from cheerful to concerned. "Sarah, you look thin," she said, watching me measure rice with the precision of a laboratory technician. "Are you feeling okay?" I assured her I was fine, that I'd just been eating healthier and getting more exercise. But when she asked to borrow $20 for coffee the next morning because she'd forgotten her wallet, I had to explain that I didn't have cash on hand, that I'd need to ask Michael. "Ask Michael?" Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "For $20? Sarah, what's going on here?" I found myself defending a system that, when explained out loud, sounded increasingly bizarre. I heard myself making excuses for why a successful 40-year-old woman needed permission to spend $20. And the words felt foreign in my mouth. But what was the alternative? Admitting that my marriage wasn't the partnership I'd believed it to be? Acknowledging that I'd traded my independence for a beautiful house and a husband who treated me like an allowance-dependent child? Jennifer left that weekend with a concerned expression and a promise to call more often. She kept that promise, but her calls became another source of stress. How could I explain to my successful, independent friend that I spent my days clipping coupons and measuring portions while my husband bought $1,000 suits? How could I admit that the confident woman she'd known for 20 years had somehow disappeared into a role that felt increasingly like performance art? The performance became more demanding as time went on. Michael's expectations for household management grew more specific and more exacting. Dinner needed to be ready at exactly 6:30, prepared from a menu he approved in advance. The house needed to be spotless at all times, decorated according to his aesthetic preferences, and ready for entertaining at a moment's notice. My appearance needed to reflect well on his success. Well-groomed but not too expensive, attractive but not attention-seeking, stylish but not trendy. I became an expert at making something from nothing, stretching budgets and resources until they seemed to multiply through sheer force of will. I could make a $5 chicken fetus for 3 meals, turn clearance vegetables into elegant side dishes, and maintain a wardrobe that looked expensive by shopping sales and consignment stores with the dedication of a professional buyer. My skills were impressive, but they were survival skills, not lifestyle choices. I was learning to live in scarcity while surrounded by abundance, and the contradiction was starting to feel unbearable. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 8 years after our wedding, when I stood in our gourmet kitchen asking my husband for grocery money while he ate a steak that cost more than my weekly food budget. But that morning was just the beginning of the end, not the end itself. Because what Michael didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Sarah Rodriguez hadn't completely disappeared when she became Sarah Chen. She'd just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment, to wake up and remind everyone exactly who she used to be. The morning everything shattered started like any other Tuesday in my carefully controlled world. I woke up at 6, made Michael's coffee exactly the way he liked it, black with 1 sugar cube, and set out his breakfast of steel-cut oats with fresh berries that I'd rationed from my weekly grocery allowance. He sat at our granite counter in his perfectly pressed shirt, scrolling through emails on his phone while eating the $60 ribeye steak he'd ordered from his favorite restaurant the night before, reheated and served with eggs I'd stretched to make last until my next shopping day. I stood across from him, still in my pajamas, clutching my empty coffee mug and trying to find the courage to ask for something that should have been a given in any normal marriage. My stomach had been cramping from hunger for the past 3 days, surviving on crackers and the vegetables I grew in our backyard garden, The refrigerator, which looked impressive from the outside with its stainless steel finish and smart technology, contained mostly condiments and the expensive wine Michael kept for entertaining clients. "Michael," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need to go grocery shopping today." He looked up from his phone with the expression he wore when I interrupted his important work, a mixture of patience and mild irritation that suggested I should have known better. "We just went shopping last weekend, Sarah. What did you do with the money I gave you?" The money he'd given me was $90 for a week's worth of groceries, down from the $150 I'd received the month before. I'd spent it carefully, buying generic brands and shopping at the discount store across town. But even with extreme couponing and careful meal planning, $90 couldn't stretch far enough to feed 2 adults for a full week, especially when one of those adults expected home-cooked meals every night. "I bought everything on the list we made together," I replied, pulling out my phone to show him the carefully documented spreadsheet where I tracked every purchase. "But we ran out of milk yesterday, and there's no bread left, and I thought maybe I could get some chicken for dinner tonight." Michael set down his fork and gave me his full attention, which somehow felt worse than being ignored. His dark eyes, which had once made me feel cherished and desired, now held a calculating coldness that made my skin crawl. "Chicken," he repeated, as if I'd suggested buying caviar. "Sarah, we talked about this. We're trying to reduce our grocery expenses. There's plenty of food in this house if you just get creative with what we have." I looked around our kitchen, taking in the empty counters and the nearly bare pantries, getting creative with what we had meant eating crackers for breakfast and canned soup for dinner, while he enjoyed restaurant meals and expensive cuts of meat. It meant skipping lunch entirely and pretending I wasn't hungry when my stomach growled during our evening conversations. "There really isn't much left," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. "Maybe just $20? I could get some basics to get us through until next week." The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm. Michael finished his steak slowly, deliberately, each bite a reminder of the abundance he enjoyed, while I stood there begging for grocery money. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the tone he used with clients who questioned his professional judgment. "Sarah, I work 60 hours a week to provide for this family. I pay for this house. Your car, your health insurance, everything you need. And you're telling me that $90 isn't enough to feed us for 1 week?" He shook his head in disappointment. "Maybe the problem isn't the budget. Maybe the problem is your money management skills." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I'd managed a successful business for years, had handled investment portfolios worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, had been financially independent and secure before I married him. But standing in that kitchen, reduced to begging for basic necessities, I almost believed he was right. Maybe I had become bad with money. Maybe I was wasteful and irresponsible. Maybe this was my fault. "I could show you the receipts," I offered, desperately. Everything I bought was on sale, and I used coupons, and I only bought what we needed. Michael stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that made me flinch. He was tall, over 6 feet, and when he moved toward me, I instinctively stepped back against the kitchen island. He wasn't threatening me physically, but there was something in his posture that made me feel trapped. "The receipts," he said, laughing without humor. "Sarah, do you hear yourself? You're asking me to audit your grocery shopping like you're some kind of employee who can't be trusted with petty cash." The comparison stung because it was accurate. That's exactly what I'd become in my own home, an employee who had to justify every expenditure to a boss who held all the power. But acknowledging that truth would mean admitting that my marriage was something other than what I'd believed it to be, and I wasn't ready to face that reality yet. "I just want to make sure we have enough food," I said, tears starting to blur my vision. "I'm not trying to be difficult or wasteful. I just need a little more money to get us through the week." Michael's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with. He reached out and touched my cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb in a gesture that once would have melted my heart. Baby, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm trying to teach you responsibility. We can't just throw money at every problem. We have to be disciplined, make smart choices, think about our future. His voice was gentle now, loving even. I'll tell you what, I'll give you $30, but I want you to really think about what we need versus what we want. Can you do that for me? $30 for a week's worth of food for 2 people. In a grocery store where a gallon of milk cost $4 and a loaf of bread cost $3. I wanted to laugh at the impossibility of it, but instead, I nodded gratefully because $30 was better than nothing, and nothing was what I'd been afraid I'd get. Thank you, I whispered, hating myself for the gratitude in my voice. He pulled out his wallet, an expensive leather billfold that probably cost more than my monthly clothing budget, and counted out $30 in small bills. As he handed them to me, his fingers lingered on mine. I love you, Sarah. Everything I do is for us, for our future together. I know it's hard sometimes, but we're building something important here. Trust me, okay? I nodded again, clutching the money like it was a lifeline. I love you too. He kissed my forehead and picked up his briefcase, preparing to leave for another day at his successful accounting firm where he managed millions of dollars for clients who trusted his financial expertise. As he reached the door, he turned back, with an afterthought. Oh, and Sarah, my mother is coming for dinner Friday night. Make sure you plan something nice. She's been talking about your pot roast, so maybe something like that? The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in our beautiful empty kitchen with $30 and the impossible task of feeding 3 people a meal worthy of Patricia's critical palate. Pot roast required a roast, which cost at least $20, plus vegetables and sides. Even if I spent every penny of my grocery money on Friday's dinner, there would be nothing left for the rest of the week. I sat down at the kitchen island where Michael had just finished his steak breakfast and put my head in my hands. The granite was cold against my elbows, and I could smell the lingering scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the aroma of meat I couldn't afford. For the first time in months, maybe years, I let myself really think about what my life had become. When had asking for grocery money become begging? When had my husband's approval become more important than my basic needs? When had I become so small, so diminished, that $30 felt like generosity instead of insult? The questions hurt, because they forced me to examine choices I'd made, compromises I'd accepted, boundaries I'd allowed to be crossed so gradually that I hadn't noticed them disappearing entirely. I'd told myself I was being a good wife, a supportive partner, a team player. But looking around our immaculate kitchen with its empty refrigerator and bare pantries, I had to face the possibility that I'd been something else entirely. A victim. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer asking if I wanted to meet for lunch that afternoon. The invitation was innocent, the kind of spontaneous plan we'd made thousands of times over the years of our friendship. But I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to figure out how to explain that I couldn't afford lunch, couldn't even afford the gas to drive to meet her, without revealing the shameful reality of my financial situation. I typed and deleted several responses, each one more pathetic than the last. Can't today, busy with household stuff. Rain check? Money's a little tight this week. Michael prefers I eat at home. Every excuse sounded hollow, even to me. Finally, I simply wrote, "Not feeling well today, maybe next week," and hit send before I could change my mind again. Jennifer's response came immediately. "Oh no, can I bring you anything? Soup? Medicine? I could stop by after work." The offer of help, simple human kindness from someone who cared about me, almost broke me completely. I wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her everything, wanted to collapse into the arms of someone who still saw me as a person worth caring about. Instead, I declined politely and turned off my phone. I spent the rest of the morning planning a menu that could work with $30 and still impress Michael's mother. It was like solving a complex mathematical equation where the variables kept changing and the solutions seemed increasingly impossible. I could buy a cheaper cut of meat and slow cook it until it was tender, use vegetables from my garden, make bread from scratch to save money. It was doable, barely, if I was creative and careful and willing to eat nothing but crackers for the rest of the week. The planning consumed me because it was easier than thinking about the larger questions that were starting to demand answers. How had my life become a constant calculation of scarcity? How had my needs become so negotiable while Michael's remained absolute? How had I become a woman who felt grateful for $30 while my husband spent more than that on a single lunch? By noon, I'd crafted a menu and shopping list that could work within my constraints. I would drive to the discount grocery store across town, use every coupon I'd clipped, buy only generic brands, and hope that the vegetables in my garden were ready for harvest. It wasn't ideal, but it was survivable, which had become my primary goal in most situations. I was getting ready to leave when I heard a car in the driveway. Looking out the window, I saw Patricia's silver Mercedes pulling up to our front door. My stomach dropped. She wasn't supposed to come until Friday, and I had nothing to offer her, no food prepared, no refreshments ready. In Patricia's world, these things mattered enormously. I opened the front door before she could ring the bell, pasting on the smile I'd perfected over years of trying to win her approval. "Patricia, what a wonderful surprise. I wasn't expecting you until Friday." She stepped into our foyer without waiting for an invitation, her designer handbag clutched in one perfectly manicured hand, and her critical gaze already surveying our entryway for signs of imperfection. I was in the neighborhood and thought, "I'd stop by to discuss Friday's menu," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes treated as commands. "I hope you're planning something special. I've been telling the ladies at the club about your cooking." The pressure of her expectations settled over me like a weight. Patricia's approval mattered to Michael, which meant it had to matter to me, regardless of my current circumstances. "Of course," I replied, leading her into our living room. "I was actually just planning the menu. Would you like some coffee? Or tea?" "Coffee would be lovely, dear." I excused myself and went to the kitchen, where I faced another small crisis. We were out of the expensive coffee beans Patricia preferred, and all I had was the generic instant coffee I'd been drinking. To save money, I made it as strong as possible and served it in our best china, hoping she wouldn't notice the difference. She noticed immediately. "This tastes different," she said after her first sip, her nose wrinkling slightly in distaste. "It's a new blend." "I'm trying," I lied smoothly. "I wasn't sure if you'd like it." She set down the cup and folded her hands in her lap. "Well, about Friday's dinner. I was hoping you could make that wonderful pot roast you served last time, with the herb potatoes and those lovely green beans. Maybe a nice salad to start, and perhaps a dessert. Something elegant but not too heavy." I nodded and smiled, mentally calculating the cost of everything she'd requested. The pot roast alone would consume most of my grocery budget, and the additional sides and dessert would push the total well beyond what I had to spend. But saying no to Patricia wasn't really an option, not if I wanted to maintain the facade that everything in my marriage was perfect. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "I'll make sure everything is perfect." "I'm sure you will, dear. You're such a good wife to Michael. He's so lucky to have someone who takes such good care of him." Her smile was warm, but there was something calculating in her eyes. "Though I do hope you're taking care of yourself, too. You look a bit thin lately. Are you feeling all right?" The question seemed innocent, but I sensed an undercurrent of judgment. Patricia had always been concerned about my appearance, my worthiness as a wife for her successful son. Looking thin could be interpreted as not eating well, which could reflect poorly on Michael's ability to provide, or worse, on my ability to manage our household properly. "I've been trying to eat healthier," I said carefully. "More vegetables, smaller portions. You know how it is." "Oh yes, I understand completely. Though you want to be careful not to get too thin. Men don't like their wives to look gaunt." She picked up her coffee cup again, took another sip, and grimaced slightly. "This really is quite different from what you usually serve." After she left, I sat in our living room surrounded by the beautiful furniture and decorations that were supposed to represent our success and happiness. The afternoon sun streamed through our expensive curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny reminders of all the things I was failing to maintain properly. I thought about the pot roast dinner Patricia expected, about the $30 in my purse that wouldn't cover even half the ingredients, about the empty refrigerator and the growling in my stomach that had become a constant companion. I thought about Michael's steak breakfast and his expensive suits and his dismissive attitude toward my basic needs. For the first time in years, I let myself get angry. Really, truly angry. Not the quiet resentment I'd been swallowing for months, but a clean, sharp fury that cut through all the excuses and justifications and polite pretenses. I was angry at Michael for reducing me to this pathetic version of myself. I was angry at Patricia for her entitled expectations and cruel judgments. I was angry at myself for accepting it all, for shrinking and diminishing and apologizing my way into this corner where I begged for grocery money while surrounded by luxury. But mostly, I was angry that I'd forgotten who I used to be. Sarah. Rodriguez had never begged anyone for anything. She'd built a business from nothing, managed her own finances, made her own decisions. She'd been confident and capable and completely self-sufficient. Somehow, in becoming Sarah Chen, I'd lost all of that. The anger felt good, cleaner than the shame and fear I'd been carrying. It gave me energy, purpose, clarity. I walked to our home office, Michael's domain where he kept his important papers and business files, and sat down at the computer I was rarely allowed to use. I started with our bank accounts, the ones that bore both our names but only Michael's access codes. I tried various combinations of numbers that might be his passwords, his birthday, our anniversary, his social security number. Nothing worked, but I wasn't discouraged. I had all day, and I was highly motivated. While I worked, I thought about the prenup I'd signed so trustingly 8 years ago. I thought about the business I'd closed and the independence I'd surrendered. I thought about the slow, steady erosion of my autonomy and the careful construction of my financial prison. But I also thought about something else, something I'd almost forgotten in the fog of gradual diminishment and careful control. Before, I'd married Michael. Before I'd become the woman who begged for grocery money, I'd been smart and resourceful and very, very good with money. And while Michael had taken control of almost everything, there was one thing he didn't know about. One account he'd never discovered because it existed in a name I'd stopped using. Sarah Michelle Rodriguez still owned something, and it was time for her to wake up. The safe deposit box key was exactly where I'd hidden it 8 years ago, taped to the underside of my jewelry box drawer beneath a layer of felt lining that Michael had never bothered to examine. My hands trembled as I peeled away the tape, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation of reclaiming something I'd thought was lost forever. The key was small and silver, stamped with the logo of First National Bank of Cleveland, and holding. It felt like holding a piece of my former self. I'd opened that safe deposit box in 2014, 2 years before I met Michael, when my marketing consultancy had hit its first major milestone. Sarah Rodriguez had been paranoid about keeping all her assets in one place, so she'd diversified not just her investments but her banking relationships. The box contained backup documents, emergency cash, and most importantly, the account information for an investment portfolio I'd never transferred into joint ownership. Sitting on our bedroom floor with the key in my palm, I felt the fog of 8 years of financial manipulation beginning to clear. Michael thought he knew everything about my resources because I'd been transparent about my business assets when we'd combined our accounts. But the safe deposit box predated our relationship, and I'd never mentioned it because it had seemed like ancient history, a relic from my single days that no longer mattered. Now, it mattered more than anything else in my world. I dressed carefully for my trip to Cleveland, choosing clothes that made me look like the professional woman I used to be rather than the diminished housewife I'd become. It was harder than it should have been because my wardrobe had shrunk along with everything else in my life. The pantsuit I'd worn to important meetings was too loose now, hanging on my frame like clothes borrowed from someone larger. But with a belt and some careful adjustments, I managed to look competent enough to conduct business at a bank. The drive to Cleveland took 45 minutes, and I used every minute of it to reconstruct the details of Sarah Rodriguez's financial life. She'd been methodical about record-keeping, paranoid about documentation, and smart about protecting her assets. The safe deposit box contained not just emergency resources, but copies of everything: tax returns, investment statements, business records, even copies of important contracts. If I was right about what was in there, I wouldn't just have access to forgotten money. I'd have proof of what I'd owned before Michael convinced me to surrender it all. First National Bank of Cleveland occupied a corner building in the financial district, all granite and glass, and the kind of imposing architecture designed to make people feel both secure and intimidated. I'd done business there for years when I lived in the city, and walking through the familiar lobby brought back memories of the woman I'd been. Confident, successful, completely in control of her own destiny. The safe deposit box attendant was a middle-aged woman named Carol, who'd been working at the bank when I'd first opened the box. She recognized me immediately, though her expression showed concern at the changes in my appearance. "Ms. Rodriguez, I haven't seen you in years. How have you been?" The name felt strange in my mouth after 8 years of being Sarah Chen, but also liberating, like putting on clothes that actually fit. "I've been well, Carol. Life changes, you know. I got married, moved to Riverside." "How wonderful for you. Let me get you signed in and we'll access your box." The familiar ritual of verification and security checks felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Here, I wasn't someone's wife begging for permission. I was Sarah Rodriguez, account holder, with rights and resources and legal standing. The woman who signed the access form had steady hands and clear handwriting. Nothing like the trembling signature I'd been producing lately when Michael grudgingly allowed me to sign necessary documents. The safe deposit box was larger than I'd remembered, and fuller. 8 years of forgetting had compressed my memories of what I'd stored there, making it seem like a small emergency fund rather than the comprehensive backup system it actually was. Carol left me alone in the small viewing room with my box, and I opened it with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization. The cash was in the bottom, $3,000 in $100 bills that I'd stored as genuine, emergency money. But more important than the cash were the documents. Copies of investment statements showing accounts worth over $200,000, business records proving the value of assets I'd transferred to Michael, and most crucially, paperwork for one investment account that had never been transferred because it was held in a trust established in my maiden name. My grandmother's inheritance had come to me when I was 25, a modest sum that I'd invested conservatively and largely forgotten about. The account had been set up in the name Sarah Michelle Rodriguez, and when I'd married and changed my name to Chen, I'd simply never updated the account information. It had continued growing quietly for 8 years, compounding and reinvesting, completely separate from the joint finances Michael controlled. The most recent statement, automatically mailed to the bank's address, showed a balance of $47,000. I sat in that small room holding the statement and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the pure, clean power of financial independence. $47,000 wasn't enough to live on forever, but it was enough to change everything. It was enough to leave, enough to fight back, enough to remember what it felt like to have choices. But even more valuable than the money was what the documents represented: proof that Sarah Rodriguez had been financially sophisticated and successful before she'd married Michael Chen. The investment records showed a woman who'd understood portfolio, diversification, tax planning, and long-term wealth building. The business documents proved that I'd built something valuable from nothing and had been successful enough to attract a buyer willing to pay substantially for my client list and reputation. Looking at these papers, I couldn't understand how I'd allowed myself to believe Michael's narrative about my financial incompetence. The evidence of my former capabilities was overwhelming, documented in careful detail by the woman who'd assembled this emergency kit. Sarah Rodriguez had known that life was unpredictable and had prepared for the possibility that someday she might need to rebuild from scratch. She'd been smarter than she knew. I photographed every document with my phone, uploading them to a cloud storage account that Michael didn't know existed. Then I carefully returned everything to the box except for $500 in cash, enough to handle immediate needs without arousing suspicion. The investment account would take a few days to access, but the cash gave me breathing room to plan my next moves. Driving back to Riverside, I felt like I was returning from a long journey rather than a short trip to the city. The woman who'd left that morning had been Sarah Chen, financially dependent and increasingly desperate. The woman driving home was Sarah Rodriguez, armed with resources and, more importantly, with the memory of her own competence. I stopped at the grocery store on my way home, not the discount chain where I'd learned to shop with coupons and careful calculations, but the upscale market where I used to buy ingredients when I was entertaining clients. With my own money in my wallet, I could afford to shop like a normal person rather than a refugee from my own life. I bought everything needed for Patricia's dinner and more: the best cut of pot roast, fresh vegetables, good wine, ingredients for a proper dessert. I also bought food for myself, real food that would fill the empty spaces in my stomach and maybe begin to fill the empty spaces in my spirit. The total came to over $100, more than 3 times what Michael had allotted for groceries. And paying for it with my own money felt like the most rebellious act of my adult life. The checker was friendly, making small talk about the weather and complimenting my selections. It was the kind of normal interaction I'd almost forgotten existed, conversation between equals rather than the careful negotiations I'd grown accustomed to. When she handed me the receipt, I folded it carefully and put it in my purse, not because I needed to justify my purchases to anyone, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to buy food without shame. At home, I put away the groceries, with something approaching joy. The refrigerator that had been nearly empty that morning was now properly stocked, and I allowed myself to eat a real lunch for the first time in weeks. The simple act of making a sandwich with good bread and quality ingredients felt like a celebration of my return to the world of people who had enough. While I ate, I began to plan. The forgotten investment account would take a few days to access fully, but I could begin the process immediately. More importantly, I could begin researching the other aspects of my situation. Michael's control over our finances had been total, but it wasn't necessarily legal. Financial abuse was a crime, and forcing a spouse into economic dependence could have serious legal consequences. I spent the afternoon on the computer, researching domestic financial abuse with the focused intensity I'd once brought to client projects. What I learned was both validating and terrifying. Everything Michael had done to me had been textbook financial abuse, isolating me from my resources, controlling all access to money, creating economic dependence, and using that dependence to maintain power in our relationship. But understanding the problem was only the first step. I needed to document the abuse, protect my newly rediscovered assets, and most importantly, figure out what Michael had been doing with all the money he'd taken from me over the years. A successful accounting firm should have been generating substantial income, and our household expenses, even including Michael's personal indulgences, shouldn't have required the level of financial control he'd imposed. I started with our joint bank statements, the ones I'd been denied access to for years. The online banking portal required a password, but I'd learned something about Michael's habits during our marriage. He was a creature of routine who used variations of the same passwords for everything. It took me 6 tries to crack his system, a combination of his birth date and our anniversary, with his mother's maiden name as the security question answer. What I found when I gained access to our accounts was shocking in its scope and clarity. Michael hadn't just been controlling our money, he'd been systematically draining it. The business account showed regular transfers to personal accounts I didn't recognize, and the personal accounts showed expenditures that had nothing to do with our household or his legitimate business expenses. There were payments to luxury car dealerships, high-end restaurants I'd never been to, expensive hotels in cities he'd supposedly visited for business, but where no business meetings were documented. There were regular transfers to an account labeled simply as Trust, and substantial cash withdrawals that happened weekly, always in amounts just under the reporting threshold that would trigger bank scrutiny. But most damaging were the investment account transfers. Michael had been moving money from our joint accounts into individual accounts bearing only his name, systematically transferring wealth that had originally come from my business assets. Over 8 years, he'd moved over $400,000 into accounts I had no legal access to, effectively stealing my premarital assets despite the prenup that was supposed to protect them. I screenshotted everything, building a comprehensive record of financial fraud that would be impossible to deny or explain away. Michael wasn't just a controlling husband. He was a thief who'd been systematically looting our marriage while forcing me to beg for grocery money. The most disturbing discovery was a file folder on his computer labeled Financial Planning, which contained detailed projections for our future that assumed my complete economic dependence. The spreadsheets showed calculations for maintaining me on minimum subsistence budgets while maximizing his personal wealth accumulation. There were even notes about potential divorce scenarios and strategies for minimizing any settlement I might claim. Michael had been planning my financial destruction for years, possibly from the beginning of our marriage. Every reduction in my allowance, every questioning of my expenses, every lecture about money management had been part of a calculated campaign to break my spirit while enriching himself. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his planning. He'd assumed that Sarah Chen was all that remained of the woman he'd married, that the competent and resourceful Sarah Rodriguez had been permanently erased by years of systematic diminishment. He'd never imagined that she might still exist, might still have resources he didn't know about, might still remember what it felt like to fight back. That evening, I cooked dinner with ingredients I'd bought with my own money, and every bite tasted like freedom. When Michael came home and complimented the meal, asking casually how I'd managed to afford such good ingredients with the limited budget he'd provided, I smiled and told him I'd gotten everything on sale. "You're getting better at stretching a dollar," he said approvingly. "I knew you could learn to be more responsible with money if you just applied yourself." I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the grateful wife who'd learned her lesson. But inside, I was calculating how long it would take to access my investment funds, how much evidence I'd need to build an airtight case against him, and how much longer I'd need to maintain this charade before I could reveal exactly who I really was. Michael had spent 8 years teaching me that I was powerless, dependent, incapable of managing my own life. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching him a very different lesson about underestimating the woman he'd tried so hard to destroy. Sarah Rodriguez was awake now, and she remembered everything he'd made her forget: how to fight, how to win, and how to make sure that people who betrayed her trust paid a price they'd never forget. The war was about to begin, and he had no idea what was coming for him. The safe deposit box key was exactly where I'd hidden it 8 years ago, taped to the underside of my jewelry box drawer beneath a layer of felt lining that Michael had never bothered to examine. My hands trembled as I peeled away the tape, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation of reclaiming something I'd thought was lost forever. The key was small and silver, stamped with the logo of First National, Bank of Cleveland, and holding it felt like holding a piece of my former self. I'd opened that safe deposit box in 2014, 2 years before I met Michael, when my marketing consultancy had hit its first major milestone. Sarah Rodriguez had been paranoid about keeping all her assets in one place, so she'd diversified not just her investments, but her banking relationships. The box contained backup documents, emergency cash, and most importantly, the account information for an investment portfolio I'd never transferred into joint ownership. Sitting on our bedroom floor with the key in my palm, I felt the fog of 8 years of financial manipulation beginning to clear. Michael thought he knew everything about my resources because I'd been transparent about my business assets when we'd combined our accounts. But the safe deposit box predated our relationship, and I'd never mentioned it because it had seemed like ancient history, a relic from my single days that no longer mattered. Now it mattered more than anything else in my world. I dressed carefully for my trip to Cleveland, choosing clothes that made me look like the professional woman I used to be, rather than the diminished housewife I'd become. It was harder than it should have been because my wardrobe had shrunk along with everything else in my life. The pantsuit I'd worn to important meetings was too loose now, hanging on my frame like clothes borrowed from someone larger. But with a belt and some careful adjustments, I managed to look competent enough to conduct business at a bank. The drive to Cleveland took 45 minutes, and I used every minute of it to reconstruct the details of Sarah Rodriguez's financial life. She'd been methodical about record-keeping, paranoid about documentation, and smart about protecting her assets. The safe deposit box contained not just emergency resources, but copies of everything: tax returns, investment statements, business records, even copies of important contracts. If I was right about what was in there, I wouldn't just have access to forgotten money. I'd have proof of what I'd owned before Michael convinced me to surrender it all. First National Bank of Cleveland occupied a corner building in the financial district, all granite and glass, and the kind of imposing architecture designed to make people feel both secure and intimidated. I'd done business there for years when I lived in the city, and walking through the familiar lobby brought back memories of the woman I'd been. Confident, successful, completely in control of her own destiny. The safe deposit box attendant was a middle-aged woman named Carol who'd been working at the bank when I'd first opened the box. She recognized me immediately, though her expression showed concern at the changes in my appearance. "Ms. Rodriguez, I haven't seen you in years. How have you been?" The name felt strange in my mouth after 8 years of being Sarah Chen, but also liberating, like putting on clothes that actually fit. "I've been well, Carol. Life changes, you know. I got married, moved to Riverside." "How wonderful for you. Let me get you signed in and we'll access your box." The familiar ritual of verification and security checks felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Here, I wasn't someone's wife begging for permission. I was Sarah Rodriguez, account holder, with rights and resources and legal standing. The woman who signed the access form had steady hands and clear handwriting, nothing like the trembling signature I'd been producing lately when Michael grudgingly allowed me to sign necessary documents. The safe deposit box was larger than I'd remembered and fuller. 8 years of forgetting had compressed my memories of what I'd stored there, making it seem like a small emergency fund rather than the comprehensive backup system it actually was. Carol left me alone in the small viewing room with my box, and I opened it with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization. The cash was in the bottom, $3,000 in $100 bills that I'd stored as genuine, emergency money. But more important than the cash were the documents. Copies of investment statements showing accounts worth over $200,000, business records proving the value of assets I'd transferred to Michael, and most, crucially, paperwork for one investment account that had never been transferred because it was held in a trust established in my maiden name. My grandmother's inheritance had come to me when I was 25, a modest sum that I'd invested conservatively and largely forgotten about. The account had been set up in the name Sarah Michelle Rodriguez, and when I'd married and changed my name to Chen, I'd simply never updated the account information. It had continued growing quietly for 8 years, compounding and reinvesting, completely separate from the joint finances Michael controlled. The most recent statement, automatically mailed to the bank's address, showed a balance of $47,000. I sat in that small room holding the statement and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The pure, clean power of financial independence. $47,000 wasn't enough to live on forever, but it was enough to change everything. It was enough to leave, enough to fight back, enough to remember what it felt like to have choices, but even more valuable than the money was what the documents represented. Proof that Sarah Rodriguez had been financially sophisticated and successful before she'd married Michael Chen. The investment records showed a woman who'd understood portfolio, diversification, tax planning, and long-term wealth building. The business documents proved that I'd built something valuable from nothing and had been successful enough to attract a buyer willing to pay substantially for my client list and reputation. Looking at these papers, I couldn't understand how I'd allowed myself to believe Michael's narrative about my financial incompetence. The evidence of my former capabilities was overwhelming, documented in careful detail by the woman who'd assembled this emergency kit. Sarah Rodriguez had known that life was unpredictable and had prepared for the possibility that someday she might need to rebuild from scratch. She'd been smarter than she knew. I photographed every document with my phone, uploading them to a cloud storage account that Michael didn't know existed. Then I carefully returned everything to the box except for $500 in cash, enough to handle immediate needs without arousing suspicion. The investment account would take a few days to access, but the cash gave me breathing room to plan my next moves. Driving back to Riverside, I felt like I was returning from a long journey rather than a short trip to the city. The woman who'd left that morning had been Sarah Chen, financially dependent and increasingly desperate. The woman driving home was Sarah Rodriguez, armed with resources and, more importantly, with the memory of her own competence. I stopped at the grocery store on my way home, not the discount chain where I'd learned to shop with coupons and careful calculations, but the upscale market where I used to buy ingredients when I was entertaining clients. With my own money in my wallet, I could afford to shop like a normal person rather than a refugee from my own life. I bought everything needed for Patricia's dinner and more. The best cut of pot roast, fresh vegetables, good wine, ingredients for a proper dessert. I also bought food for myself, real food that would fill the empty spaces in my stomach and maybe begin to fill the empty spaces in my spirit. The total came to over $100, more than 3 times what Michael had allotted for groceries, and paying for it with my own money felt like the most rebellious act of my adult life. The checker was friendly, making small talk about the weather and complimenting my selections. It was the kind of normal interaction I'd almost forgotten existed. Conversation between equals rather than the careful negotiations I'd grown accustomed to. When she handed me the receipt, I folded it carefully and put it in my purse. Not because I needed to justify my purchases to anyone, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to buy food without shame. At home, I put away the groceries, with something approaching joy. The refrigerator that had been nearly empty that morning was now properly stocked, and I allowed myself to eat a real lunch for the first time in weeks. The simple act of making a sandwich with good bread and quality ingredients felt like a celebration of my return to the world of people who had enough. While I ate, I began to plan. The forgotten investment account would take a few days to access fully, but I could begin the process immediately. More importantly, I could begin researching the other aspects of my situation. Michael's control over our finances had been total, but it wasn't necessarily legal. Financial abuse was a crime, and forcing a spouse into economic dependence could have serious legal consequences. I spent the afternoon on the computer, researching domestic financial abuse with the focused intensity I'd once brought to client projects. What I learned was both validating and terrifying. Everything Michael had done to me had been textbook financial abuse. isolating me from my resources, controlling all access to money, creating economic dependence, and using that dependence to maintain power in our relationship. But understanding the problem was only the first step. I needed to document the abuse, protect my newly rediscovered assets, and most importantly, figure out what Michael had been doing with all the money he'd taken from me over the years. A successful accounting firm should have been generating substantial income, and our household expenses, even including Michael's personal indulgences, shouldn't have required the level of financial control he'd imposed. I started with our joint bank statements, the ones I'd been denied access to for years. The online banking portal required a password, but I'd learned something about Michael's habits during our marriage. He was a creature of routine who used variations of the same passwords for everything. It took me 6 tries to crack his system, a combination of his birth date and our anniversary, with his mother's maiden name as the security question answer. What I found when I gained access to our accounts was shocking in its scope and clarity. Michael hadn't just been controlling our money, he'd been systematically draining it. The business account showed regular transfers to personal accounts I didn't recognize, and the personal accounts showed expenditures that had nothing to do with our household or his legitimate business expenses. There were payments to luxury, car dealerships, high-end restaurants I'd never been to, expensive hotels in cities he'd supposedly visited for business, but where no business meetings were documented. There were regular transfers to an account labeled simply as Trust, and substantial cash withdrawals that happened weekly, always in amounts just under the reporting threshold that would trigger bank scrutiny. But most damaging were the investment account transfers. Michael had been moving money from our joint accounts into individual accounts bearing only his name, systematically transferring wealth that had originally come from my business assets. Over 8 years, he'd moved over $400,000 into accounts I had no legal access to, effectively stealing my premarital assets despite the prenup that was supposed to protect them. I screenshotted everything, building a comprehensive record of financial fraud that would be impossible to deny or explain away. Michael wasn't just a controlling husband. He was a thief who'd been systematically looting our marriage while forcing me to beg for grocery money. The most disturbing discovery was a file folder on his computer labeled Financial Planning, which contained detailed projections for our future that assumed my complete economic dependence. The spreadsheets showed calculations for maintaining me on minimum subsistence budgets while maximizing his personal wealth accumulation. There were even notes about potential divorce scenarios and strategies for minimizing any settlement I might claim. Michael had been planning my financial destruction for years, possibly from the beginning of our marriage. Every reduction in my allowance, every questioning of my expenses, every lecture about money management had been part of a calculated campaign to break my spirit while enriching himself. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his planning. He'd assumed that Sarah Chen was all that remained of the woman he'd married, that the competent and resourceful Sarah Rodriguez had been permanently erased by years of systematic diminishment. He'd never imagined that she might still exist, might still have resources he didn't know about, might still remember what it felt like to fight back. That evening, I cooked dinner with ingredients I'd bought with my own money, and every bite tasted like freedom. When Michael came home and complimented the meal, asking casually how I'd managed to afford such good ingredients with the limited budget he'd provided, I smiled and told him I'd gotten everything on sale. "You're getting better at stretching a dollar," he said approvingly. "I knew you could learn to be more responsible with money if you just applied yourself." I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the grateful wife who'd learned her lesson. But inside, I was calculating how long it would take to access my investment funds, how much evidence I'd need to build an airtight case against him, and how much longer I'd need to maintain this charade before I could reveal exactly who I really was. Michael had spent 8 years teaching me that I was powerless, dependent, incapable of managing my own life. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching him a very different lesson about underestimating the woman he'd tried so hard to destroy. Sarah Rodriguez. was awake now, and she remembered everything he'd made her forget. How to fight, how to win, and how to make sure that people who betrayed her trust paid a price they'd never forget. The war was about to begin, and he had no idea what was coming for him. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes ordinary moments feel historic. I woke up before my alarm, my body humming with anticipation and a strange calm that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't waking up as a financial prisoner in my own home. Today, Sarah Rodriguez was taking back everything that had been stolen from her. Michael followed his usual morning routine with the precision of a man who believed his world was completely under control. Coffee at 6:15, shower at 6:30, breakfast at 7. He sat at our kitchen counter reading emails on his phone while eating the eggs I'd prepared, completely unaware that by noon, every account he controlled would be frozen by court order. "I'll be late tonight," he said without looking up from his screen. "Taking the Morrison account to dinner at the Capitol Grill. Big client. Important to make a good impression." The Capitol Grill, where entrees started at $60 and wine by the glass cost more than he'd given me for weekly groceries. I nodded and smiled, playing my role for the last time. "Of course, honey. I'll keep dinner warm in case you're not too late." He kissed my cheek absently and headed for the door, his expensive briefcase in one hand and his BMW keys in the other. I watched through the window as he backed out of our driveway, probably thinking about his important dinner and his impressive client, having no idea that he'd never make it to that restaurant. At exactly 9 o'clock, I received the first text from Lisa Davidson. "Freeze orders executed. All accounts locked as of 8:47 a.m. Criminal investigation officially opened. You're clear to proceed." The second text came from Jennifer. "State licensing board has been notified. IRS investigation triggered. His business accounts are being audited starting today." I sat in my kitchen reading those messages and felt a satisfaction so pure it was almost spiritual. Michael had spent 8 years teaching me that I was powerless, that my survival depended entirely on his goodwill, that questioning his authority would lead to disaster. In less than 2 hours, he was about to learn how catastrophically wrong he'd been. My phone rang at 10:30. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice carefully modulated to sound like the same submissive wife he'd left that morning. "Hello? Sarah." His voice was tight with controlled panic. "I'm having some issues with our bank accounts. Did you try to access anything online this morning?" "No, of course not. You know I don't have the passwords." The lie came easily, because it was technically true. I hadn't accessed our joint accounts that morning. I'd accessed my own account, the one he didn't know existed. "There's some kind of freeze on everything. The bank says there's a court order, but that's impossible. I haven't been served with anything." "A court order? What does that mean?" "I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Don't talk to anyone about this, okay? If anyone calls asking questions about our finances, you don't know anything." "Of course, Michael. Should I be worried?" "No, baby. It's probably just some bureaucratic mistake. I'll get it sorted out." The endearment that once would have comforted me now sounded desperate, like a man trying to convince himself as much as me. I hung up and immediately called Lisa Davidson. "He knows about the freeze," I reported. "He thinks it's a mistake." "Perfect. He hasn't been served yet because we wanted the account secured first. Process server is heading to his office now. By lunch, he'll understand this isn't a mistake." The morning passed slowly, each hour marked by my phone buzzing with updates from Lisa's team and Jennifer's contacts. The criminal investigation was moving faster than expected, because Michael's pattern of behavior fit profiles that financial crimes investigators knew well. The audit of his business accounts had already revealed irregularities that suggested client funds had been diverted. Most importantly, the freeze on his assets was comprehensive and immediate, preventing him from hiding or moving money while the investigation proceeded. At noon, my phone rang again. This time, Michael's voice carried a different quality. The sharp edge of a man who was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. There are some people here asking questions about our finances, and they seem to think there's been some kind of fraud. This is obviously a misunderstanding, but until we get it sorted out, you can't talk to anyone. If anyone contacts you, you tell them to speak to my attorney." "Fraud? Michael, what's happening? You're scaring me." "Nothing's happening except some bureaucratic confusion that my lawyer will straighten out. But Sarah, this is important. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to meet with anyone, and do not answer questions about our money. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, but Michael, I'm worried. Should I come down there?" "No, stay home. I'll handle this and be back tonight to explain everything." The call ended abruptly, leaving me alone in our house with the echoing silence of a life that was about to change forever. But instead of the anxiety that would have paralyzed me just a week ago, I felt energized by the approaching confrontation. Michael was about to discover that the helpless wife he'd left that morning had been an illusion, and the woman who would be waiting when he came home was someone he'd forgotten existed. I spent the afternoon preparing for his return with the same careful attention I'd once given to client presentations. I cooked his favorite meal, set the table with our best china, and opened a bottle of expensive wine that he'd been saving for a special occasion. When he walked through our front door that evening, everything would appear normal, domestic, exactly as he expected to find it. Michael arrived home at 8:30, 3 hours later than usual, and looking like a man who'd aged years in a single day. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. He dropped his briefcase by the door and slumped into a kitchen chair without his usual kiss or greeting. "Rough day?" I asked innocently, setting a plate of his favorite pot roast in front of him. "The roughest." He looked at the meal with something approaching gratitude. "Thank God for you, Sarah. At least I know I can count on you to keep things normal here while everything else goes crazy." I poured him a glass of wine and settled into my own chair, studying his face across our dining room table. He looked exhausted, defeated, and completely unaware that the woman sitting across from him had orchestrated every moment of his terrible day. "Tell me what happened," I said gently. "Maybe I can help somehow." Michael laughed bitterly. "Unless you've secretly become a criminal defense attorney, I don't think there's much you can do to help with this mess." "Criminal defense? Michael, you're scaring me again." He took a long drink of wine and rubbed his temples like a man fighting, a headache that wouldn't quit. "There's been some kind of investigation opened into my business. The authorities seem to think there are irregularities in how I've been handling client accounts. It's completely ridiculous, but they've frozen everything while they conduct their investigation." "Everything?" "Business accounts, personal accounts, even my credit cards. I couldn't even buy lunch today." The irony of his complaint was so perfect that I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. "My attorney says it's just a fishing expedition, that they're hoping to find something." "That isn't there. But in the meantime, we're going to have to be very careful about money." "How careful?" "We'll have to live on cash for a while. I've got about $3,000 in my safe, and hopefully this will all be resolved in a few weeks." $3,000 to live on while his accounts were frozen. Less than he'd spent on wine in the past month. Less than he'd given me for groceries in 2 years. The cosmic justice of it was so beautiful that I almost felt guilty for enjoying it as much as I did. "I'm sure it will work out," I said soothingly. "You're a good man, Michael. Anyone who knows you would understand that you'd never do anything dishonest." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with gratitude for my unwavering support. "Thank you for believing in me, baby. I know this is going to be hard on you too, but we'll get through it together. We always do." I squeezed his hand back and smiled. "Of course we will. We're a team, remember? The next 3 days followed a pattern that would have been comical if it hadn't been so satisfying. Michael left each morning believing he could resolve the situation through sheer force of will and legal maneuvering, and returned each evening more defeated and desperate than before. The investigation was expanding, his business was under scrutiny, and his assets remained frozen while authorities built their case. Meanwhile, I played the role of the supportive wife with Academy Award-worthy precision. I cooked his meals, listened to his increasingly frantic explanations, and offered comfort and encouragement while privately reveling in every moment of his growing panic. Each day brought new revelations about the scope of his crimes, and each revelation confirmed that my decision to destroy him had been entirely justified. The investigation had uncovered not just his theft from our marriage, but systematic embezzlement, from client accounts totaling over $2 million. He'd been using his position as a trusted financial advisor to funnel money into personal accounts, gambling investments, and luxury purchases that he'd hidden from everyone, including me. The pot roast dinners I'd been forced to beg for had been funded by stealing from people who'd trusted him with their life savings. On Thursday evening, he came home with news that made my carefully maintained composure almost impossible to sustain. "They want to interview you," he said without preamble, collapsing into his chair at our kitchen table. "The investigators want to talk to you about our household finances, about what you knew about my business accounts." What should I tell them? Nothing. Tell them you don't know anything about my business, that I handled all our finances, that you were never involved in any professional decisions. Which is all true, right? Of course it's true. You never told me anything about your business affairs. Good. My attorney will be there during the interview to make sure they don't ask inappropriate questions. Just answer honestly and keep it simple. You're an innocent wife who trusted her husband to handle the complicated financial stuff. The description of me as an innocent wife who couldn't handle complicated financial stuff might have been insulting if it weren't so perfectly ironic. Michael had spent 8 years convincing me that I was financially incompetent, and now he was counting on that same perceived incompetence to protect him from the consequences of his crimes. When do they want to meet? Tomorrow afternoon. 2 o'clock at the Federal Building downtown. Will you be there? My attorney advised against it. He says it's better if you handle this alone, that having me there might make it look like I was coaching your answers. I nodded solemnly, as if the prospect of facing federal investigators alone terrified me rather than thrilled me. Michael had no idea that tomorrow's interview would be the culmination of everything I'd been planning, the moment when Sarah Rodriguez would finally step out of the shadows and reveal exactly what she'd been doing while Sarah Chen begged for grocery money. Friday morning, I dressed carefully for what Michael believed would be a routine interview with investigators who were fishing for information I didn't possess. I chose a conservative business suit that projected competence and credibility, and carried a briefcase that contained documentation Michael never imagined I had access to. When I kissed him goodbye that morning, he squeezed me tightly and told me how proud he was of my strength. "Just remember," he said, "you don't know anything about the business accounts. You're just an innocent wife who trusted her husband." "I understand," I replied. "I'll be very careful about what I say." The Federal Building was an imposing structure of granite and glass that reminded me of the banks where I'd once conducted my own business as Sarah Rodriguez. Walking through the security checkpoint with my briefcase full of evidence, I felt like I was returning to a world where I belonged, where competence was respected and truth mattered more than manipulation. The interview room was smaller than I'd expected, furnished with a conference table and chairs that had seen better days. 2 investigators waited for me: Agent Patricia Williams from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and Agent James Harrison from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They were younger than I'd anticipated, probably in their 30s, with the focused intensity of people who took financial crime seriously. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Williams began, "thank you for coming in today. We understand this must be a difficult time for you. Please call me Sarah. And yes, it's been very confusing. I'm not sure how I can help you, but I want to do whatever I can. We appreciate that. We're investigating irregularities in your husband's business accounts and personal finances. We need to understand the household financial arrangements, what you knew about his business practices, that sort of thing. I nodded earnestly. I'll help however I can, but I should tell you up front that Michael handled all our finances. I wasn't involved in any business decisions. For the next 30 minutes, I played the role Michael expected me to play. The financially naive wife who'd trusted her husband completely and knew nothing about his professional activities. I answered their questions with apparent honesty, describing our household budget, my limited access to accounts, and my complete dependence on Michael's financial management. The investigators exchanged glances that suggested they'd heard similar stories from other wives of financial criminals. They were sympathetic, but not particularly surprised by my account of financial dependence and isolation. Mrs. Chen, Agent Harrison said gently, I want you to know that if you were unaware of your husband's activities, you're not in any legal jeopardy. We understand that spouses can be victims in these situations. Victims? Financial abuse often accompanies financial crimes. Controlling a spouse's access to money, creating economic dependence, isolating them from financial decision-making. These are common patterns we see. I nodded as if this were news to me, as if I hadn't spent weeks researching exactly these patterns and building a comprehensive case around them. I don't think of myself as a victim, I said carefully. Michael always said he was protecting me from financial stress by handling everything himself. And you believed that? I wanted to believe it. It seemed easier than questioning someone I loved. Agent Williams leaned forward slightly. Sarah, is there anything else you think we should know? Anything that might help us understand the full scope of what's been happening? This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the opening that would allow me to reveal everything without appearing to betray my husband. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a folder containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. Actually, I said, hesitantly, there might be something. I found some papers when I was cleaning out Michael's office, and I didn't understand what they meant, but now that you're asking about irregularities, I slid the folder across the table. Agent Williams opened it and her eyebrows rose as she began reviewing bank statements, transfer records, and documented evidence of systematic theft. Where did you get these? They were in Michael's computer. I was looking for our insurance information after the accounts were frozen, and I found files I didn't recognize. I printed some things because I thought they might be important, but I didn't understand what they meant. Agent Harrison was now studying the documents with intense focus. Sarah, these show substantial transfers from business accounts to personal accounts. Did you know about these transactions? No, I had no idea we even had these accounts. Michael always said our finances were simple, just basic checking and savings. According to these records, your husband moved over $400,000 from joint accounts into individual accounts bearing only his name. You weren't aware of this? I let shock register on my face, as if this were the first time I'd understood the scope of what Michael had done. $400,000? That's impossible. Where would that money have come from? According to the documentation you've provided, much of it appears to have originated from assets you brought into the marriage. Business proceeds, investment, accounts, that sort of thing. But those were supposed to be protected by our prenup. Agent Williams and Agent Harrison exchanged another look, this one suggesting that my innocent discovery of incriminating evidence had just blown their investigation wide open. Sarah, Agent Williams said carefully, would you be willing to provide testimony about these financial arrangements? What you've shown us suggests criminal fraud beyond what we originally suspected. If it would help other people who might have been hurt by this, yes. I want to do the right thing. The interview continued for another 2 hours, during which I provided detailed testimony about 8 years of financial abuse, while maintaining the facade of a woman who was just beginning to understand what had been done to her. By the time I left the federal building, I'd given investigators everything they needed to expand their case from simple embezzlement to systematic fraud, theft, and financial abuse. Michael was waiting anxiously when I returned home that afternoon, pacing our living room like a caged animal. How did it go? What did they ask? What did you tell them? They asked about our household finances, about what I knew about your business. I told them the truth, that you handled everything, and I wasn't involved in business decisions. Good. That's exactly right. Did they seem satisfied? I think so. They were very nice, very understanding about how confusing this all is for me. Michael pulled me into a tight hug, relief evident in every line of his body. I'm so proud of you, baby. I know that must have been scary, but you did exactly the right thing. This will all be over soon, and we can get back to our normal life. Our normal life, where I begged for grocery money while he stole from clients and lived in luxury, where I was grateful for $30 while he spent thousands on meals I was never invited to share, where I believed I was lucky to have a man who would take care of me, never understanding that he was systematically destroying me. Michael, I said softly, there's something I need to tell you. What is it, sweetheart? The investigators asked me to identify some documents they found in your computer files, bank statements and transfer records. I told them I'd never seen them before, but Michael, they showed me transactions for hundreds of thousands of dollars that I didn't know about. The color drained from Michael's face so quickly that I thought he might faint. What transactions? Money moved from accounts with both our names to accounts with only your name. They said it looked like my business assets had been transferred without my knowledge or consent. Michael sat down heavily in his chair, his hands shaking slightly, as the implications of what I'd just told him began to sink in. Sarah, you have to understand, I was protecting those assets, investing them for our future. Everything I did was for us. But why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think we were struggling financially when there were hundreds of thousands of dollars I didn't know about? Because you wouldn't have understood the complexity of it. I was trying to protect you from financial stress. By making me beg for grocery money while you moved my inheritance into accounts I couldn't access? The question hung between us like a sword, and I watched Michael realize that his carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. The helpless wife, who'd never questioned his financial management, was asking questions that exposed the fundamental cruelty of what he'd done. Sarah, it's not like that. You're not understanding the full picture. Then explain it to me. Explain how protecting me required stealing from me. Explain how you were acting in our mutual interest while forcing me to live in poverty. Explain how a man who claims to love me could watch me lose weight from not having enough food while he ate $60 steaks. Michael stared at me as if I'd transformed into someone he didn't recognize, which was exactly what had happened. The woman confronting him wasn't the broken victim he'd created through 8 years of systematic abuse. She was Sarah Rodriguez, and she was done pretending to be anyone else. Who are you? He whispered. I'm the woman you tried to destroy, I replied. I'm the woman who built a successful business from nothing, who managed complex financial portfolios, who was completely capable of handling her own affairs before you convinced her she was helpless. I'm the woman who's been investigating your crimes for weeks while you thought she was too stupid to understand what you'd done to her. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning realization, and finally, fear. You've been investigating me? I've been documenting 8 years of financial abuse and theft. Every transaction you thought I was too ignorant to understand. Every account you moved money to. Every client fund you diverted to pay for your luxury lifestyle while your wife begged for food money. Sarah, you don't understand what you're doing. If you cooperate with this investigation, you'll destroy everything we've built together. Everything you've built on the foundation of my stolen assets and other people's trust, you mean? Everything. You've built while reducing me to a financial prisoner in my own home? Michael stood up abruptly, his attorney's instincts finally overriding his shock. I want you to stop talking. Don't say another word to anyone without my lawyer present. This investigation is targeting me, but if you keep cooperating with them, you could be considered complicit. Complicit in being your victim? Complicit in whatever irregularities they think they've found. Sarah, I'm trying to protect you here. I laughed, a sound that held 8 years of suppressed rage and newfound freedom. Protect me? Like, you protected me when you stole my inheritance? Like you protected me when you forced me to beg for money to buy food? Like you protected me when you made me believe I was financially incompetent while you embezzled millions from clients who trusted you? Millions? Michael's voice cracked. Sarah, what have you done? I've told the truth about everything. About the systematic theft of my assets, about the financial abuse, about the pattern of behavior that investigators now understand extends far beyond our marriage. Michael sank back into his chair, the fight going out of him as he realized the scope of what was happening. They know about the client accounts? They know about everything, Michael. Every crime you thought you'd hidden, every theft you thought would never be discovered, every lie you told to cover up what you were doing. It's all documented now. All part of an official investigation that will expose exactly what kind of man you really are. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 8 years of deception finally acknowledged between us. When Michael spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What happens now? Now you face the consequences of underestimating the woman you tried to break. You'll be arrested, probably within the next few days. You'll be charged with embezzlement, fraud, theft, and financial abuse. Your business will be destroyed, your professional license revoked, your assets seized to compensate the people you stole from. And you? I rebuild my life with the resources you didn't know. I still had. I help other victims of financial abuse understand that they have options. I make sure that what you did to me never happens to anyone else. Michael looked around our beautiful house, taking in the expensive furniture and designer decorations that had been purchased with money stolen from clients and coerced from me. I thought I was taking care of you, he said weakly. You thought you were breaking me, I corrected. You thought you could reduce me to someone so small and grateful that I'd never question your authority. You thought Sarah Rodriguez was gone, forever, replaced by a woman who would beg for grocery money and feel grateful for the privilege. Sarah, I'm sorry. I know I made mistakes, but I do love you. You love the idea of a woman who exists solely to validate your power. You love having someone completely under your control, someone whose survival depends on your generosity. That's not love, Michael. That's ownership. The sound of cars in our driveway interrupted our conversation. Through the window, I could see black SUVs with government plates, the kind of vehicles that meant official business was about to be conducted. Sarah, Michael said desperately, please, you can still fix this. Tell them you were confused, that you didn't understand the documents. We can work this out together. I stood up and walked to the window, watching as federal agents approached our front door with the measured pace of people who had warrants and intended to use them. Michael, I said without turning around, meet the consequences of your actions. You spent 8 years teaching me that I was powerless. Today you're going to learn what real powerlessness feels like. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by authoritative knocking. Federal agents, we have a warrant for Michael Chen. I opened the door to find Agent Williams and Agent Harrison, along with several other agents whose presence suggested this wasn't a routine arrest. Mrs. Chen, Agent Williams said formally, we have a warrant for your husband's arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and theft. Is he here? He's in the living room, I replied, stepping aside to let them enter. I watched from the doorway as they read Michael his rights and placed him in handcuffs. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of consequences he'd never imagined would reach him. As they led him toward the door, he turned back to look at me one last time. "Sarah, please, don't let them destroy everything we built together." "We didn't build anything together, Michael. You built a lie on the foundation of my stolen life, and now that lie is collapsing under the weight of the truth." Agent Harrison handed me a business card as they prepared to leave. "Mrs. Chen, we'll need you to come in next week to provide formal testimony. Your cooperation has been essential to this case." "Of course. And Agent Harrison? It's Rodriguez now. Sarah Rodriguez." After they left, I stood alone in our house for the first time in 8 years, surrounded by expensive furniture and designer decorations that had been purchased with stolen money while I begged for food. The silence was different now. Not the oppressive quiet of isolation, but the peaceful calm of freedom. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Saw the news? Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm perfect. Sarah Rodriguez is officially back in business." The next few months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, asset recovery, and the systematic dismantling of Michael's criminal enterprise. The investigation revealed that he'd stolen over $2 million from clients, many of them elderly, people who'd trusted him with their retirement savings. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. My divorce was finalized quickly once the criminal case established the pattern of financial abuse and theft. The prenup that was supposed to protect my assets was invalidated due to the fraud involved in its execution, and I recovered not just my original business proceeds, but substantial damages for 8 years of economic abuse. Most importantly, I used my experience to help other women recognize and escape financial abuse. Working with organizations that supported domestic violence survivors, I developed educational programs that taught women to identify the warning signs of economic control and helped them develop strategies for protecting their financial independence. 6 months after Michael's arrest, I was sitting in the office of my new consulting business, Rodriguez Financial Advisory, when I received a letter forwarded from the prison where he was serving his sentence. Inside was a single page in Michael's careful handwriting. "Sarah, I know you'll probably never forgive me, but I need you to know that I really did love you. I know I made terrible mistakes, but everything I did was because I wanted to take care of you. I hope someday you'll understand that my intentions were good, even if my methods were wrong. I'm sorry for hurting you. Please remember the good times we had together. Love always, Michael." I read the letter twice, then filed it in the folder marked Evidence of Continued Manipulation that I kept for my educational presentations. Even from prison, Michael couldn't acknowledge what he'd really done or accept responsibility for the systematic destruction he'd caused. Even facing 12 years of consequences, he still wanted me to believe that his abuse had been motivated by love rather than the need to control and dominate. But his inability to understand the truth no longer had the power to confuse or hurt me. Sarah Rodriguez knew exactly what love looked like, and it didn't involve making someone beg for food money. Real love didn't require destroying someone's independence to prove its value. Real love didn't steal and lie and manipulate while claiming to protect. That evening, I had dinner with Jennifer at a restaurant where the wine cost more than Michael used to give me for weekly groceries. We toasted my freedom, my new business, and the satisfying knowledge that justice had been served not just to Michael, but to every person he'd victimized. "Any regrets?" Jennifer asked as we finished our expensive meal with money I'd earned through my own work. "Only one," I replied. "I regret that it took me so long to remember who I really was." "And who are you, Sarah Rodriguez?" I smiled and raised my glass one more time. "I'm a woman who doesn't beg for anything anymore. I'm a woman who builds her own security and makes her own choices. I'm a woman who learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to stay broken." The restaurant was full of couples sharing dinner, some clearly happy, others going through the motions of connection without real intimacy. Looking around at all those relationships, I felt grateful for the hardest lesson of my life. That being, alone and free was infinitely better than being accompanied and enslaved. Michael had spent 8 years trying to convince me that I needed him to survive, that my value as a woman depended on his approval and protection. He'd been spectacularly wrong about both things. I didn't need anyone's permission to be successful, anyone's approval to be worthy, or anyone's protection to be safe. I was Sarah Rodriguez, and I had everything I needed to build whatever life I chose to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.